everyone. Welcome to a very important conversation that we're going to be having today about privilege. Um, Hi, fantastic.
Hi.
Hi, Rukmini.
Hey, can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you, yes. How are you?
I'm all right. I guess as all right as one can be given the state of the world.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I'm just gonna. Yeah, okay. Switch off the lights to make it a bit more. Yeah. Okay. So, thank you so much for doing this. I think it's. Uh, I am a bit nervous, but also looking forward to it at the same time. So, welcome. I've introduced you a little bit in the creative, but why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and kind of what your journey has been so far?
Oh, well, that's a difficult one to answer. It becomes increasingly difficult over the years.
Quick introduction.
Oh, well. So, yeah, the journey has been, I guess, that of a learner, a student philosopher, if I may call myself that. It's been, in many ways, a lot of my professional journey has been also about a personal longing that I look for and, in a way, work towards out in the world. So, what I do is I straddle between the worlds of corporate organization and leadership development on the one side and peace building on the other. So, it's sort of between boardrooms and conflict zones. So that's where I live in
Wow.
terms.
Oh, that's amazing, actually. Okay, so in some ways similar also, I suppose.
I guess, yeah. You've had quite a journey yourself in terms of transitioning from one place to another. So.
Yes, yeah. I think there is something about being in these intense situations that the body. Uh, Birth is intense. It kind of gives you that, and even when it's like the most straightforward, it's that it's quite intense to be around, isn't it? So I guess yeah, there's something to be said for wanting to or seeking that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So, I this is the first time we're actually. I think I've sort of talked about this in kind of different contexts, but I really want us to explore and talk about this idea of privilege.
Mhm.
And really, the background to all of this is deepening into, I mean, I think we're both doing trauma work together, but sort of just understanding where the individual ends and the collective begins and vice versa, right? And they're not so well defined in itself. So that makes the collective and what happens in the collective even more powerful, right? In terms of inequalities and hierarchies and our own understanding, and especially in terms of what has unfolded now, in the last 6 months. So if I can just open out by asking, what is privilege? What do you see as privilege? And I guess, what has your own, personal journey been of understanding the various layers of kind of your own, privilege, for example?
Okay. Um, Well, there's so many lenses with which to look at that, right? Uh, but in simple terms, if I have to go by, so given that part of my work is in peace education, and there when we work with privilege, we talk of it as privilege that is sometimes inherited and privilege that can be earned, right? So privilege that's inherited is, for example, my caste, my money that might, or legacy that might come from family in some sense, or the flip side of it also, the lack of it that comes from there. Uh, there's sometimes genetic privilege in terms of the kind of body I have or don't have. So all of that is inherited and not quite my choice. And I would think that also perhaps includes the kind of place and community and religion and country that we are born in, because that's not something that we work towards. It just happens to us, and then we work with it. And then there's the earned privilege in terms of the kind of work I may have put into, myself, in terms of perhaps earning a degree that then lends me privilege to, or access to some spaces or some kind of money or whatever. So yeah, broadly, there's that academic definition of privilege. But if I were to look back at my lived experience of it, I would think for a long, long time I've been most unconscious of it, in the sense that I'm not sure how much of my life, as a child, teenager, perhaps even an early adult, I'm not sure how much of it I got by because of the last name I have. Right? And the privilege of being born into a Brahmin family in a Hindu dominant country plays out in a way that I perhaps don't even see, because that's the unconsciousness of the privilege, right? Having it means that you don't quite see it, because that's something you take for granted. So it's only been when I've become conscious of it and looked at how people who are not like me in terms of background, in terms of either inherited privilege or earned privilege, when who are not like me and what their life experiences seem to be in similar circumstances like mine, how perspectives can change completely. That's in a way brought me to become a little more conscious of it. I guess it's, in many ways, it's come up to the fore in the last 6 months with the lockdown. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do for all of us. And like you say, it's challenging sometimes to figure where I end and the collective begins, right? And so how much of my privilege attacks another, and how much of my privilege can be, a positive contributor to another, that's something one needs to make a very, very conscious effort and choice towards.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. Very similar to my experiences as well. And I think here's the thing about privilege is whenever, and I was largely not just unaware of it, but also I think there is this narrative around everybody feels like they are, what do you call it? Being marginalized or whatever it is, right? So there's that conversation around, well, I'm not rich and I had to work for whatever I got, and what do you mean privilege, right? Like there is the not seeing it, but also there is that narrative that everybody feels like they have somehow been sort of wronged, or that life has been hard for them, and then there is that part to you that sort of says. So I think I heard a lot of that also growing up, right? Like this narrative around how life is so hard for the upper castes, and you sort of, that's what you hear growing up, right? Like you don't really, um, it's only after I left home that you really kind of start engaging with the world, right? And even then, I think, like you said, there is that privileged bubble, right? And I spent 15 years abroad, where being the model minority, right, in the US and the UK, if you're Hindu and upper caste and educated, you're the model minority, right? So you don't really, you're the poster child for how minorities, kind of should be, right? And there is a lot of that masking and kind of, the invisibility and the need to be more mainstream, to be accepted, and whatever that is, right? Whether it's the hair or the accent and whatever it is. But I think I've had a lot of conversations where, my friends would talk about racial inequalities in the US or the UK, but also fail to see that they've got caste-based privilege in India,
Yeah.
right? So I think it's that dichotomy of being the model minority, and then you get on a flight and you come here, and suddenly you're the main, you're the dominant, caste or whatever, right? And that is sort of so there was that, I think, and it was a journey, right? And like most people, a lot of people around me, because you don't see it, you don't think it exists, right? So for me, I left India when I was quite young, and then the narrative that I had somehow told myself was that it was the thing of the past and it doesn't exist anymore and all of that stuff. Until I became an adult, and through the context of my own marriage and choosing the life partner, etc., you're sort of like, oops, yeah, no, it exists. It exists in your own family, and then you see it, it's like this rude sort of like, oops, but I think even denying that it doesn't exist is a privilege in itself, right? Like that's the thing that's kind of mind-blowing. It's sort of like fish can't see water almost.
Absolutely. It's the blindness to atrocities is also a privilege, right? It's a terrible side effect of it, but yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah. And I don't know, it talk to us about the interesting thing, and this is what I'm exploring about my own self, is I've always seen myself as a feminist, but it wasn't until I became an adult that I actually, the version of feminism that I thought I was, had so many issues in it.
Would you want
And
to say more about that? I mean, how do you mean feminism?
no, I think there is this equivalent of, the white liberal feminism in India as well, right? It's the urban, educated
Yeah.
women. So there is, I'm not saying that, one narrative is more important than the other, but the idea that you could be so, um, you could have such strong feelings about discrimination and hierarchy on one side, and not actually recognize that there are other forms of hierarchy where you are actually in the, what would you call, oppressor. I hate the triangle words, but you know what I mean, like where it's favorable to you, and we can be so blind to that
Yeah.
sometimes.
It's so yeah. I'm looking at several angles of response to that, but yes, I think particularly, I'm not sure if I can generalize this, but as an Indian, uh, there's of course the very consciously aspired for, and the sense of whiteness that is ingrained in a lot of us that are so-called upper caste, in terms of those of us who get to go to English schools, and you're encouraged to speak in English, and in the process you while you think, at least as a child, I thought, okay, I have to learn English because that's how you get jobs, that's what you're told. But it's more than that, right? The whiteness that gets ingrained in the process of it is not something that, at least as a child, I definitely did not notice it. That there is a process of colonization that's happening in the effort of trying to be good at English and doing, in that sense, white things because of the kind of literature and everything that you're exposed to. And in the process, I think what, at least for me, what I internalized was also uh, the in a way, the mindset of the oppressor, for lack of a better term, and therefore also the contempt for what I deem is the lower, right? And therefore uh, a sense of saying that, okay, I prefer a certain kind of a job. There are some things I don't like doing, and that translates into every aspect of my life. Like, there are things at home I don't like doing, and when I really dissect those things in terms of what are my preferred things I like to do and things I don't like to do, there is definitely a privilege reflecting there in terms of things I can afford not to do
Yes.
because it can be outsourced, right?
Yes.
And then that colonization continues to play out in me, through me, without me ever having to be uh, aware of it. And that's the danger of privilege, right? That unless we have conversations around it, uh, we keep perpetrating things that we perhaps don't want to consciously perpetrate, but we also want the convenience of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We were also, I think, you speak about the parts, right? Like how there are parts to us that carry the sort of the oppressor in us, and then there's parts of us that carry the victim, for example, in us.
Yeah.
How do you reside in those? I think for me, mm, they're not separate, isn't it? Like, they're all a part of you, right? And so I guess my question is, um, when we unpack privilege, it gets very uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Because I think, it involves a lot of, sitting with discomfort.
Yeah.
And I think, is there an element of, once you woke and once you start seeing things, you can't really go back to not seeing them.
Yeah.
But how do you engage with what comes up as we do this work?
I wish there was an easy formula, but well, for the way I continue to work with it is to learn to stay with the discomfort, and more than anything else, I think what we really need all across the world today is the ability and the courage to stay uncomfortable. Because there are things that come up which then I might label as being shameful, things I don't want to look at, things that make me disgusted of myself, right? And yet it's important to sit with that, because where do I go with it? It's part of me, right? It's in me. And so it does become important for me to sit with it and to say, okay, it's something that I am doing. I can, in an idealist way, aspire to say, let me transform it right away, and it's not going to happen. And so can I at least look at incremental moves, even if there's a tiny change that I'm able to make around it? Maybe the first step could simply be to acknowledge and say, okay, this exists. There's this part of me that is bigoted, right?
Yes.
And just to name it, I find it very powerful to even name it, because in naming it, I'm starting to see it, and the more I see, the more I'm able to sense it in terms of how it operates in my day-to-day action, in terms of choices I make, things I do, things I don't do, language I use, all of that. And then to look at saying, okay, so what does this do to me? What does the existence of this part of me do to me? And also, what does it do to the system around me?
Yeah.
So when you spoke about, where do I end and where does the system begin? For me, it's a tough question, because one is to say, yes, there's a personal boundary and then there is the collective outside of me. But another way to look at it is also that the collective is a projection and an extension of me. What's unprocessed in me is reflected onto the collective. So in that sense, what's out in the collective also belongs to me.
Exactly.
It's perhaps all things that bother me out in the collective are things that I have not processed for myself. And things that I perhaps enjoy and am okay with in the collective are things that I've perhaps integrated in myself. So in that sense, there isn't really a difference in what is personal and what is universal.
Yes, I love that. Yes. So I have a broader question around, sort of healing and trauma and some of the things that we're sitting with. But before I go there, because you've got a lot of experience in organizational sort of leadership and kind of engaging at that level, one of the things that I'm finding I mean, okay, look, it's been a long time since I went to college, but, since I was in college, but I was really disheartened the past few weeks about this real toxicity in my college alumni groups of children, I mean, of people who are now in college and are graduating, and this lot of impetus around gender inclusivity and hiring and all of that stuff, right? And yet, the Indian C-suite is predominantly male and upper caste, right? Like, there's no denying that. I think there's even research around that, right? So there's that on one hand, and then there is all these policies at the college hiring level, which sort of sends all kinds of shockwaves into the college community, and that discussion really very quickly degenerated into this young gentleman who's still in college saying, because companies are hiring women quota based, women, there's a lot of animosity towards these quota women when they go into the workplace, and because men are frustrated, it's going to lead to more rapes in the workplace. And so for me, that's a really quick, how quickly it deteriorates into, this discussion around gender and, hiring. Very quickly, this, it goes from there to justifying gender-based violence. Right? So this is the thing about why I think this privilege is so important for us to discuss, because it very quickly degenerates into this kind of bullying, oppressive, violent behavior, right? So I feel like there's probably more of that toxicity now in young people who are in college than there was, maybe a decade ago or whatever. But I mean, coming back to that question, we do have a lot of diversity and hiring initiatives, in the corporate world, and yet most of the Indian boardroom is, the overwhelming majority of the Indian boardroom is upper caste and male. Talk to us about that.
Well, difficult to do that without going into a rant, but
Rant away.
yeah, it's not just that, right? It's upper caste, male, cisgender, heterosexual.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
So it's really narrow. It's not. It's
and
not
able-bodied, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and able-bodied. Yes. So it's a very, very narrow sort of tunnel or a funnel that we have for what we define as leadership. And I would think part of that also comes from a very hyper masculine way of education, of our family systems, of our social systems, all of which are hyper masculine. And when I say masculine, I mean in terms of the energy of it, right? That sense of go out and conquer and compete, and you have to be the first, and all of that, which is a very masculine perspective and worldview. And all our reward systems, whether it's in our schools or universities or even at workplaces, the reward systems are around how masculine can you be, regardless of what your gender is, right? So the reward system is about, can you come first? Can you beat your competitor? Can you basically victory at any cost, right? So when we've constructed systems around it to perpetuate it, then obviously the result is a very homogeneous kind of a boardroom.
Yes.
So what we need to work on, of course, is one part of the effort is at the corporate level in terms of, yes, DEI policies and all of that. But beyond that, I think we need to start at the grassroots in terms of the way we engage with and invite the feminine energies in our homes, in our schools, colleges, because once we are conditioned to balance it, then in our workspaces, then we are more receptive to both kinds of energies there. And then that's also healthier, even from a mental health perspective and a physical health perspective. It's healthier because then you're not burning yourself up trying to win, and knowing very often knowing that victory has no meaning for you anyway, right? So in a way, we are knowingly perpetuating meaninglessness, which is not healthy in any form.
Absolutely.
So yes, there is intervention needed at the corporate level, but I will think it's also intervention needed in each one of us in whatever space we operate in, home, work, communities, everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah. So, Rukmini, I know that, I mean, obviously we're doing somatic experiencing together, but you're also trained in more modalities, isn't it, for mental health and healing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I use several modalities. I mean, usually the medium of it tends to be coaching for me, because that's something that I believe in as a value more than as a process. But yes, within that, I tend to work with nonviolent communication and NLP and several other techniques.
Yeah. So, one of the things about all of these sort of mind-body based modalities or even cognitive modalities is, do you get the feeling that the way we talk about mental health itself is so rooted in that privilege? I mean, the idea that an individual is ultimately responsible for his or her outcome, and that you have the means to achieve or become whoever you want to be, itself is quite a privileged sort of upper class, caste, white kind of notion, right? Because I think, and that's not reality for most people, in the sense that because of the color of your skin or your caste, there are a lot of people who are leading invisible lives grouped as a collective, isn't it? And actually, I'm wondering if, in a hierarchical culture, we can weaponize anything, right? Like patriarchy can weaponize anything. And I feel like, the question is, are we weaponizing a well-balanced nervous system as if, that's kind of the holy grail that everybody has equal access to, and that it's somehow your fault for not, taking care of your nervous system. What do you think?
Well, interesting to think of it that way. I'm not sure if you're weaponizing it or making it like an extreme reward of some kind. I mean, making that a privilege. Yeah, I would think in many ways we are now talking about health as a privilege, health of any kind, physical, mental, emotional health, spiritual health. We've made it something that needs to be earned and achieved. Right? So you want physical health, you've got to go invest in that gym and have a yoga trainer and do whatever the whole capitalism around it, right? And that if you can't afford all of that, then you don't deserve whatever health you want, but at the same time, there isn't. I mean, given caste and the all other systems that we have around us, uh, not everyone has even the permission to relate to and take care of their bodies in the same way. Right? I mean, if you look at like the Valmikis in India, right, for example, that most of them don't see it as a choice to be a sewage cleaner. Right? I mean, that's what they expected to do. That's what they're born into, and uh, if they choose to, through their own effort, try and rise out of it, it's considered rebellion, right? So when you're talking of them not having access to even basic sanitation, I mean, forget great food or any of that, just a very basic sense of hygiene in their lives. If that becomes a matter of privilege, then then the rest of the health is not even a question, right? We can't even talk about it. So in that sense, yeah, I think it's important that when we talk of mental health or physical health for that matter, it does become important to talk of the systemic context and what are the permissions I have, and what are the permissions I can possibly give myself if I make some effort, and what are permissions that are dangerous for me.
You bring up a really good point, right? So the idea that, and this makes me wonder how we approach a lot of things, right? So um, we talk about, for example, in healthcare, we talk about autonomy, we talk about respectful maternity care, we talk about informed consent, but the basic idea is that somehow your body is yours, or that you have the privilege to be individuated, right?
Yeah.
And we talk about, for example, women having need, you should leave abusive marriages, and we showcase examples of women who have done that and who have successfully rebuilt their lives, and we hold them up, and yet there is also that aspect of, most of these women that we showcase had the financial support of their families, or they were educated enough or confident enough to fend for themselves financially. They may have parents who took care of their children, where they went out and rebuilt their lives, etc., right? So there's a lot of that stock advice or stock feminism, I think, may also be rooted in privilege, right? It's like telling even women in birth, saying that you should go doctor shopping, and you should ask for this, and you should ask for that, and that's a privilege that not many women have.
Yeah, I mean, think about the number of women around the world who, I mean, their relationship with the body is just that of a resource, right? It's like a production factory, and you're expected to, you're expected to make the body work and produce what it's expected to produce. It's a very utilitarian kind of a relationship that one tends to have in so many parts of the world. That's a reality for so many women, even a lot of women that are otherwise privileged. You're still, whether you like it or not, you're expected to have kids, and you're expected to put your body through things that you may not necessarily want to put it through. So, yeah, while we talk of individuation, whether I really own my body is very questionable for a large part of the world.
And then also women's bodies being used as tools of violence and oppression, right? Like we've seen in the recent cases. I think it is also, yes, the woman doesn't own her own body, but also I think she becomes an object of um, a lot of violence, right? I mean, in terms of communal, and I guess that's what people don't understand about privilege. I think it's not about whether, you were rich or poor, or whether you had to work hard for what you got or whatever, but it's the privilege that I'm not going to be killed because of my caste or my name or my face or the color of my skin. Is huge, isn't it? That we don't think about it in those terms at all. I think there was no, yeah, I mean, we don't think about it in those terms.
Yeah. That's the unconsciousness of it, right? And that I don't see any other way than having conscious conversations around it. But uh, even the safety to have those conversations is a privilege, right? I mean, you and I can talk about it without people trolling us about it. I mean, imagine if we were Dalit women having the same conversation.
Yes,
It would be an
yes.
entirely different matter.
Yeah, yeah. I have somebody I respect a lot. She identifies as a Dalit. She's a birth worker, and this is the thing about conscious privilege, the unearned privilege, right? Is um, not being able to come out in the open about and talk openly about these issues as a first person lived experiences, because of the ripple effect that it has on people around you, or sometimes even yourself, without becoming the target when things go wrong. I mean, that is a huge privilege, isn't it? Exactly. I mean, the fact that you and I are here talking is huge privilege in itself. Yeah.
I noticed somebody commenting about, why do you have your last name here or something like that, about how that's a privilege. And yeah, that's a privilege. And particularly in the recent months, that there's been a lot of questions to me around that, about why you flaunting your caste. And so strangely for me, it wasn't so much my decision in terms of having it as part of my name, but the fact that my parents moved from Kerala to Mumbai, and apparently when I was enrolled in school, the school demanded that you have to have a surname. You can't not have a surname. So, and that's how I've got the name stuck with the surname, and that's how it's in all my certificates. And it was a very unconscious decision to stick with it through my life. And in the last few years, I've often thought about, okay, so what does it mean now? Should I maybe, not drop the last name? And to me, that doesn't make sense either, in the sense it feels like an easy way out. It's also a privilege to be able to conveniently drop it, right? And say that, okay, I'm absolving myself of everything that comes with the caste. I'd rather stay with it and do what it takes to make my privilege available for anyone that can use it in a good way, rather than hiding it and in a way accentuating the privilege by not having that last name being shown.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not like, yeah, the ability to drop it is also a privilege, but also, like you're saying, it's sort of, yeah, the work is still there to be done, right? Like, regardless of what the name is, the work is still kind of left to be done. It's interesting, right? Because um, I don't know if I've shared this with you. There is a certain Carnatic musician who has made an effort to talk about caste when Carnatic music is very, Brahmin dominated, right? And he himself being being a Brahmin, right? So he speaks about it, right? And then there is a lot of, obviously he's a very controversial figure in the Carnatic music circuit. But it was interesting until, and I thought it was great. Like, wow, okay, good. We need this. That was my kind of, oh, look, I like this guy. This guy's, doing good work, that sort of thing, which he's trying, And it wasn't until somebody pointed it out that I noticed that what had happened was because he spoke out, he made either it was his choice or the Sabha's choices. So he made a choices to stay away from the December music season in all the main Sabhas. But actually, what it did was he now becomes a prized possession, right? So now he only does international, big ticket concerts. So his stock value, his concert value has gone up because he's become more exclusive and he won a Magsaysay award for his work, etc. But it hasn't actually benefited the people whose space he's occupying or might have occupied otherwise, right? And that was mind-blowing for me to kind of think about it in that sense, because that's not immediately apparent at all. We think that we should somehow be the voices and versus sort of not taking up the space and kind of almost muting ourselves so that the voices that need to be heard can be heard louder. Like, I don't know, this is blowing my mind right now because like, like.
Yeah, it's, I'm guessing this is the person who wrote about the guys who make the mridangam and all of that.
Yes, exactly. And the question is the proceeds from the book, like who did it benefit, right? Like, did it benefit his pocket versus did it really, yes, the caste and the cowhide and all of that. I think it's important to talk about it, but ultimately it's not, what did it do for the people, for those artisans? I don't know,
So it's also, it can't only be one person's effort, right? Yes, perhaps there was a fallout that this person in a way professionally benefited in some way, but I'm not very sure of this narrative around, whose space am I taking up? Because I don't see it as an either or, in the sense that there is enough space for everyone. And if I can be someone else's voice and use my privilege towards that, it doesn't mean I'm taking away someone's voice. It's perhaps also a way of amplifying this. And also looking at where am I coming at it from? If I hold myself as a rescuer, then yes, then it becomes about saying I'm taking somebody else's voice, and instead of letting them speak, I'm sort of doing it on their behalf. I don't think we need to do this as a rescuer. I would think that, yes, I mean, let's look at the migrant crisis, for example, right? Where, I mean, the deeper we worked with it in the last few months, the realization was that at the end of the day, the highest agency in this whole process lies with the migrant themselves. In terms of the fact that they can choose to walk back and say, okay, I'm not returning to the city and I'll figure a different way out, difficult as it may be. And in the interim, I think, yeah, that's how it will be. It will seem warped in the interim, and that interim can last a few decades for all I know. But because we're talking of a systemic change and it's a system that's sustained for a few millennia, right? But at the end of the day, the agency lies with the underprivileged, in that sense, whoever the underprivileged is in a given context. And the one that is privileged, that's on the other end of the spectrum, can in a way amplify and say what needs to be said in a way that you create space for this agency to also arise. So I don't quite see it as an either or in terms of capturing somebody's space, but it's about doing both. And yes, in the process, if somebody has a, a fallout which happens to be positive for them, so be it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is where it gets really muddled up in a lot of people's heads, right? Because, when you look at the magnitude of all of this, all the systemic hierarchy and all of that stuff, this is a place where a lot of us are quite conflicted, right? Yes, of course. I think, there's a lot that needs to be changed. And I think it's sort of like that now what on the one hand, but also, what do you call it, like you said, right? I mean, we're trying to dismantle a whole system, and that it's going to take time, etc., right? But if I um, don't stand, I mean, what I'm saying is, uh, I think there's a lot of guilt and shame that comes up for a lot of people, whether it's conscious or not. And then there is also this grappling around the gray areas. For example, what I mean by that is, we might have family or friends that aren't quite on this journey, for example, right? And then, what do we do? You have, it's sort of like they're nice people, they're my family, they're my friends, and so there is that level of ongoing dialogue that's needed, which I guess I can't if I um, burst out or whatever. Like, if I don't hold myself in place, I'm not actually facilitating that conversation, right? So tell us about, I mean, there's a need to kind of exile people and that just like really kind of come out all guns blazing versus trying to create sustained change while being a part of the system. I think that is the issue, right? Like, any systemic change can only happen when the people in the system work to change it, not by saying this is too much. It kind of be outside the system looking in.
Yeah. It's like Peter Senge talks about it, right? That you can't change a system unless you recognize your handprints that also co-create that system. So it does become important to look at how am I contributing to the system. Yes, in the short run, it's a very uncomfortable process. And when I say short run, I pretty much mean all our lifetimes. It will be uncomfortable in the sense that we're talking about, we're talking about a change that ideally needs to happen at both levels simultaneously, the individual and the systemic. Having said that, obviously it doesn't quite happen that way. The individual voices that rise first, and the systemic effect is seen only much, much later. And so, yes, in the interim, it's very likely that we will see very warped effects of the individual voices rising. And that can be interpreted in multiple ways, like this musician benefiting from it in an unfair way or whatever. But having said that, that's an interpretation, right? But at least he did raise his voice.
In some way, yeah.
Right? So it's a matter of us living with the discomfort around saying that, yes, in the interim, we will see very warped effects of it when we try and utilize our privilege in a manner that is conscious. But that's something we need to live with. And in the process, I would think it's really important that if we want to work with this consciously, we need to develop a lot of emotional resilience to be able to sustain dialogue with people that we don't agree with. Because at the end of the day, otherwise, if we then, like you say, if we keep exiling people, then we're only talking to the converted, and that doesn't really bring about any change either. So it does become important to have those very uncomfortable and even draining conversations at times, but ultimately that's what dialogue is, right? That you need to be able to sit with very different points of view and look at what will honor this particular moment, and in the next moment that answer may change, but at least in this moment can we come to some sort of a balance, and the balance can tilt again in the next minute. But can we keep at it? And yes, that does need a lot of resilience. Yeah, that's where again it comes back to, can I therefore have have the agency of my own body and my own mind in a way that I can work with it.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a very interesting thing you mentioned about the exiles. And as much as we exile people, we also exile parts of ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more? I think that's fascinating. I think it'd be good for the viewers to understand this idea of parts inside ourselves. And yeah.
So, so what I exile outside of me, without going into the language of parts work, like people that I push away, people that I think I don't agree with, people who make me uncomfortable. When I push them away in any form, I'm also in a way pushing away a part of me that's, the part of me that they reflect, right? I'm reacting to them because there is something unprocessed about that worldview within me. So if there's somebody who tells me that, you've got to, like I posted last week on Facebook, and someone talked about saying, you can't be talking about this whole Dalit rape and something around secular rape, whatever that means. So, I mean, the whole idea of saying, we've got to keep our Brahmin privilege. And yeah, the really easy way out and really a much desired way out for me is to alienate that person and say, I don't want to talk about it. But it does become important to engage, because in alienating, what I'm doing is I'm not talking to that part of me which is scared about losing my own privilege as a Brahmin. I need to sit with that part and say, okay, so if I'm having these conversations, and if that means that there's going to be very tangible changes in my life, what are conveniences I'm losing in the process? And am I really ready to lose it? And am I preparing myself for it actively? Because otherwise, then I can keep talking about it till the cows come home, but I won't really do anything about it in my life. So then that's not, it's not a lived ideal. It's just an aspired for thing, and it's a good to say thing. So it does become important then to talk about saying, okay, what am I scared of? What does the Brahmin in me say? And yes, one way is to have that dialogue internally, but an easier way for a lot of us is to really externalize that dialogue, have another person mirror that part of me and talk to them and see what emerges from there. I may not like the answer, but at least it leads me to some truth about myself. It helps me know myself better.
Wow. That was deep. I think that's so many layers to reflect on, that sort of, not wanting, like, what does this mean for me? That sort of thing, right? Like, and I think there is also different layers to, and it also brings up a lot of fragility, right? Like, when somebody points out your privilege, immediately I think there is a lot of, not even defense, sometimes it's like sort of downright defensiveness, but a lot of times it reflects as whataboutery. You see this in the social media all the time, right? The minute we talk about Dalit women being raped, somebody will say, oh, but what about that case? Oh, but what about this case? Right? And there is so much of sort of defensiveness and fragility, isn't it, for us, like to really kind of engage in that without making it about ourselves or um, trying to minimize that experience, or I don't know, like, what happens then, right? Like, that is that what you're talking about? Is that happens because of those parts that we don't want to see in ourselves, which is
Yeah.
that the oppressor part and the part that is used to the privilege and is so scared that they lose the privilege.
Yeah, it's my own shadow, right? I mean, things that I sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly suppress because they're too ugly. And I want to maintain this nice image of myself, and so I don't want to confront things about me that are not quite likable or not pretty. And yeah, so there is that shadow side to all of us, uh, which we react to when we see it outside of ourselves, and that needs to be engaged with. I don't see a way out of it.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I think there are some questions around like this idea of what is privilege and what's caste privilege. The minute we say something like that, I've heard things like, "Oh no, but I've taught kids of all castes, and I do charity work, and I do this and I do that, and I'm not as casteist as my dad was, or I'm not as casteist as the next door neighbor was, or whatever."
Mm.
But I think when you go down, it's like, yeah, okay, so one generation ago they might have said don't marry outside of the caste, but you are saying don't marry outside of the religion, which is sort of the same thing, like,
Yeah.
I think there is, while I think there is a lot of public, sort of political correctness around caste or whatever, but the real face of it is really in the family, right? Like, I think the work is done in the family, because, I mean, anyone can be a public speaker, but it's much harder to have that conversation around ourselves and create change inside our families, because that is our first sort of immediate circle of influence, I guess, right? So while a lot of like, talk to us about that, like, in terms of that immediate circle around you versus the outside world.
So yeah, when you say family, for me, it would extend to whatever my inner circle is, which could be biological family, it could be a community that I'm close to, or whoever I regard as family in that sense, because ultimately these are people that uh, perhaps are greatly impacted by me and I'm impacted by them. So I would think of family in that sense of the term, not
Yes,
necessarily biological.
yes, of course, yeah.
And yeah, I think a lot of our discomfort around saying don't talk of intersectionalities, don't talk about the fact that it's a Dalit and a rape or something and something. If we avoid talking of intersectionalities, I would think is because we a lot of our relationship conversations, and when I say relationship, I mean relating to people, relating to society, relating to the world, everything. The whole idea of a relationship is so binary, right? The classification in our heads often is about saying, okay, these are family, these are not family, these are
Yeah.
friends, they're not friends, these are this, these are not this, right? So there's a yes or a no, black or white kind of a categorization, and therefore when we try and address the gray, we don't quite know how to respond to the gray because we are only trained to respond to black and white.
Yes.
And so when intersectionality of any kind comes in, I would think it's almost a reptilian brain response to say, okay, I don't know how to deal with it, so fight or flight. Right? So
Yes.
It used to be like that, where so when someone brings up Dalit and rape in the same sentence, then it's like saying, okay, I've got to respond from the brainstem, and that's what we seem to be doing in these very eruptive conversations that seem to be happening right now. So I think it
Rukmini,
becomes important
we're about,
there
it
to.
says it's 5 seconds. Do you want to come back and